Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're venturing into, well, a really interesting and, let's be honest, sometimes surprising corner of human experience. Unusual sexual interests, often called fetishes or kinks.
Right.
Now, this might be territory some of you haven't explored much, maybe feels a bit uncomfortable,
Sure, it can be.
but we've gathered a collection of first-hand accounts, observations from people discussing attractions they've actually encountered.
So these are personal stories, really.
Exactly. Think of it as an exploration into the vast landscape of human desire, guided by these individual takes.
That's a great way to put it. What we have isn't like a scientific study, but it's a set of perspectives, anecdotes, opinions, and they really highlight the sheer variety of things that can lead to sexual arousal.
Yeah.
So our goal in this deep dive is to look closely at this diversity, to understand the scope of these interests and maybe question what we even mean by normal when it comes to attraction.
Yeah, absolutely. We're here to explore and understand, not to judge.
Definitely not judging, just exploring.
Okay, so to get us started, maybe ease us in a little. Our sources mentioned some interests that might be a bit more familiar, or at least talked about more openly sometimes.
Like what?
Things like pup play, where people enjoy dressing and acting like dogs.
Right, that comes up. And findom, financial domination.
Yeah, fandom. And also inflation, which is the sexual interest in,
Yeah.
well, becoming bloated.
Okay. So even those might sound pretty unconventional to some listeners.
Oh, for sure. But they kind of illustrate how broad the spectrum can be, even before we get into the really specific stuff.
And what strikes me reading through these is the incredible specificity that can exist. Like, one of the initial stories that really jumped out was about someone being sexually interested in the idea of being flushed down a toilet or a drain.
Wow.
And what's wild is that this person apparently had this interest before that movie Flushed Away ever came out.
No way.
Yeah. It really drives home the point that, for almost any idea you can possibly imagine, no matter how particular or seemingly odd, there's likely someone, somewhere, who finds it arousing.
It's almost mind-boggling, isn't it? Just the sheer range.
It really is.
And the sources bring this to life with some very vivid encounters people shared. Take the foot fungus fetish.
Oh, right. That one.
Yeah, we have an account of someone actively seeking out people with active foot fungus or ingrown toenails and offering a very specific kind of intimacy and paying for it.
Yeah, the payment part was mentioned.
It really makes you wonder, like one of our contributors did, what kind of life experiences or, I don't know, internal wiring could lead someone to find something most people consider, well, unpleasant, to be sexually appealing.
That's a huge question, isn't it? And the sources themselves kind of touch on potential origins. There's a brief, almost throwaway thought about very early childhood experiences shaping things.
Okay.
But then there's a more intriguing idea, maybe a biological component, kind of like how some people taste cilantro as soapy.
Oh, interesting comparison.
Yeah, the notion that our fundamental sensory perceptions could differ so drastically,
Yeah.
leading to completely different experiences of the same thing, pleasure versus, well, revulsion. That's definitely something to think about.
It really opens up some fascinating possibilities. And then we get into the truly specific examples. The backpack zipper fetish. Not the whole backpack.
Just the zipper.
Just the zipper. Or the attraction to the sensation of sweat drops on armpit hairs.
So incredibly precise.
These examples really underscore just how focused and particular sexual arousal can be sometimes.
Yeah.
It's not always about broad categories. Sometimes it's the tiniest, most unexpected detail that just clicks for someone.
Precisely. And these examples, they really challenge our own ideas of what we consider sexually important, right?
Totally.
What's remarkable is how an everyday object like a zipper or common bodily sensation can become the absolute center of intense arousal for somebody. It just highlights the deeply personal, subjective nature of it all.
Okay, so then we move into some experiences that might make listeners a bit more uneasy.
Yeah, some of these are tougher.
One anecdote talks about a college hookup where the other person specifically asked for a black eye.
Ooh. Yeah, I remember reading that.
And the person sharing the story makes it really clear how uncomfortable and hesitant they felt, especially with someone they basically just met.
Right.
It really brings up the whole topic of personal boundaries, doesn't it? Even when you're talking about unusual interests.
That's such an important point. It really highlights the crucial difference between, say, consensual exploration within a trusting relationship
Right.
and a request like that from a near stranger. Even when we're discussing unconventional stuff, the basics, consent, communication, respecting limits are absolutely vital. Paramount, really.
Couldn't agree more. And then Almost on a lighter note, but still very specific, there's the mention of an online community dedicated to wet floor signs.
Yes, those yellow plastic signs.
Exactly. It just goes to show, I guess, the power of the internet to connect people with even the most niche, incredibly specific interests.
Well, if you zoom out a bit, it really illustrates how online spaces can bring together people who share these, highly specific passions.
True.
And it also suggests that what might seem totally bizarre from one angle can be a source of connection, community, even validation for the people who share that interest.
Okay, so now, let's proceed with a bit more caution. We need to touch on some of the more extreme examples mentioned in our sources.
Yeah, understood.
There's the crush fetish. It's described as involving women in stiletto heels, crushing small, live animals.
Hmm.
And the reaction in the source is one of, well, strong disgust, which isn't hard to understand why that would be the case for many people.
And it's vital here to acknowledge those very strong negative reactions that these more extreme examples bring out. The sources clearly show that.
Absolutely.
The description of crush porn involving animal cruelty is, it's undeniably disturbing. It raises serious ethical questions that go way beyond just differences in sexual taste.
Definitely. Then there's a truly troubling story about a woman who would apparently seek out homeless individuals late at night for specific sexual acts,
Right. That one was. Yeah.
including unprotected sex and unsanitary practices. The reasoning given, as the source recounts it, was that these individuals supposedly didn't have sexual contact with others.
Which is a huge assumption and
It
just.
raises very serious concerns, obviously, about potential exploitation, major public health risks.
That particular account is deeply concerning. It really moves beyond just unusual sexual interest and gets into potential exploitation, a profound disregard for the well-being and safety of vulnerable people.
Yeah.
It highlights how certain attractions, unfortunately, can manifest in ways that are really harmful and unethical.
The vomit fetish is also mentioned.
Hmm.
And the source expresses a very visceral reaction, like feeling physically ill at the thought of witnessing or participating in vomiting for arousal.
That reaction really comes through in the text.
And then there's the term figging. One source encountered it and immediately asked for a toned-down explanation, which tells you something about its shocking nature, even to someone who seemed relatively open-minded about kinks.
These examples really push the boundaries, don't they? They highlight the vast spectrum we're talking about and the intensity with which interests can vary.
For sure.
The strong aversion to something like vomit, the discomfort around figging, it just underscores the deeply personal, often gut-level nature of our sexual boundaries and preferences.
So all of this naturally leads us back to thinking about origins, the psychology behind some of these unusual interests.
Right. Where does this stuff come from?
The sources themselves raise some really intriguing questions, like what life experiences could lead someone to find something typically seen as disgusting to be arousing?
Yeah, that fundamental question keeps coming up.
There's that fleeting thought about a possible genetic predisposition.
Yeah.
Maybe like the cilantro thing again.
Right, that comparison. Or even a very unusual craving linked to maybe a nutritional deficiency, like how pregnant women sometimes crave dirt or chalk.
That analogy was mentioned, yeah.
Now, these are definitely interesting possibilities to consider. The idea of a biological predisposition, it's speculative, sure, but it does raise the question, could some individuals just have different inherent responses to certain stimuli? And the cravings analogy, while probably not a direct parallel for most fetishes, it does remind us of the powerful influence our underlying biology can have on our desires and urges.
And then there's the suggestion, floated in the sources, that some of the more extreme fetishes, maybe like findom or the crush fetish example, might potentially be linked to underlying mental health issues or unhealthy compulsions.
That connection is raised.
Which isn't to say every unusual interest is a sign of some deep problem, obviously.
Yeah, absolutely not. That's a crucial distinction to make.
But it's a point raised about the potential for a more complex picture in certain cases.
Exactly. While exploring the diversity is valuable, it's also important to acknowledge when certain attractions might be tangled up with psychological distress or could potentially lead to harmful behaviors. The sources themselves express a kind of concern about harm and exploitation in some of the really extreme examples.
Yeah, you can feel that. On a somewhat lighter note, though, we do get an interesting explanation for the balloon popping fetish. That was quite insightful.
Oh yeah, tell me about that one again.
Apparently, the arousal wasn't just from the sound of the popping itself.
Okay.
It was from witnessing someone else being able to forcibly pop the balloon, which contrasted with the individual's own fear of it.
Ah, so it's about power or control, maybe?
Seems connected to themes of courage, maybe overcoming a personal anxiety vicariously.
That's really revealing, isn't it? It shows the complex psychological layers that can be underneath what seems like just a bizarre fetish on the surface. It suggests the focus of arousal isn't always the specific act or object itself, but maybe the emotional and psychological stuff it represents for that person.
Fascinating. And throughout all these accounts, we also see this really wide range of reactions from the people sharing or commenting.
Mm-hmm.
Amusement, disbelief, outright shock, disgust.
Oh, yeah. All over the map.
Someone mentions wanting to bleach my brain after reading about some of this stuff.
Huh. Saw that one.
Another feels like they've encountered too much internet for one day.
Mm.
There's even a sarcastic remark about, like, maybe they could profit from toenail fungus.
These very visceral reactions, they're just a natural human response, aren't they? When we encounter something so far outside our own experience and our understanding of sexuality,
Yeah.
the humor and the shock, they really highlight the challenge these unusual interests pose to our personal boundaries, our ingrained sense of what's normal.
And it's interesting, one user seemed relatively unfazed by many of the more, let's say, extreme kinks,
Mhm.
but found the anecdote about the encounter with the homeless individual particularly shocking. It really highlights the different things will cross different people's personal lines.
That truly emphasizes the subjective nature of what we find acceptable or disturbing. Our own values, our life experiences, our individual ethics. They all play a huge role in shaping how we react to this kind of information.
Which brings us right back to that core idea of what is normal and the importance of personal boundaries.
Exactly.
What one person finds arousing can be completely baffling or even repulsive to someone else. We see clear examples of personal limits being expressed in the sources, the discomfort with figging, the strong negative reactions to the crush fetish, the vomit fetish.
Precisely. Our sources underscore that while there's this vast spectrum of sexual interests out there, individuals also have very personal, often non-negotiable boundaries. What might be a harmless fantasy or a consensual activity for one person can be a source of major discomfort or even moral objection for another.
And even something that might seem relatively common in certain circles, like the mentioned interest in a wife being, quote, absolutely railed,
Mm-hmm.
is acknowledged by the source as being pretty weird if you actually stop and think about it outside of those specific contexts.
That's a great point.
It shows that even within seemingly mainstream interests, there can be elements that, when you examine them closely, might fall outside more conventional understandings of sexual attraction.
And this really brings us back to the fluid, subjective nature of normal.
Mhm.
What's considered typical or acceptable in sex can vary enormously across different people, different cultures, even different times.
Right.
Something that might seem highly unusual to one person could be a perfectly accepted part of another person's sexual expression and experience.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, it's clear these firsthand accounts really highlight the immense diversity and intensity of human sexual interests.
Absolutely. It's a landscape that often defies easy explanation.
For sure. And it certainly pushes the boundaries of what many of us might consider normal. We've encountered everything from interests that seem a little quirky to those that are truly extreme and, frankly, disturbing.
And the reactions to these have been just as varied, as we saw.
Yeah.
And our aim throughout this whole exploration, it hasn't been to pass judgment, obviously, but rather to neutrally present the information we found in these sources.
Right. Just lay it out there.
Acknowledge the wide range of human responses, and ultimately encourage you, the listener, to maybe think more deeply about the subjective nature of arousal itself.
So here's a final thought to maybe chew on.
Yeah.
How do societal norms in our own personal journeys truly shape our understanding of sexuality and what we consider to be normal?
That's the big question.
What might the very existence of such incredibly diverse interests tell us about the intricate workings of human desire and the, I guess, ever-evolving boundaries of our own personal experiences?
It really invites us to consider the multifaceted nature of human sexuality, doesn't it? And maybe approach discussions around it with a sense of curiosity, a willingness to acknowledge the vast spectrum of human experience.
Well said.
And if you are curious to explore further, we just encourage doing so with discretion and sensitivity. Always keep in mind the importance of respect and ethical considerations.
Absolutely. Something important to remember.